Hello and good evening, I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
You're watching Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Now, last Saturday, Malaysia announced that it would be joining 172 countries to participate in the COVID-19 Vaccines Global Access Initiative, known as COVAX. COVAX is a pooled procurement mechanism for new COVID-19 vaccines that aims to provide participating economies fair and equitable access to vaccines by pooling purchasing power from these nations across a range of candidate vaccines. So joining us on the show tonight to discuss COVAX prospects and limitations, we have Dr. Swee, one of the founders of the advocacy group, the Malaysian Health Coalition. Swee, welcome to the show. Welcome back to the show. It's good to have you here. Now, it seems that Malaysia joined COVAX at the very last minute. But then, if you think about prior to that, there were a lot of voices, there were many voices in support of Malaysia joining COVAX, but there were also some more, I would say, cautious voices, warning us perhaps against it. Now that we have announced our intention to join COVAX, where do you see the possible trade-offs in this decision?
Well, Melissa, we'll have to begin by firstly stating that COVAX is the least imperfect vehicle that we have. And a lot of people are investing a lot of hopes into COVAX, thinking that it will be a magic solution for what I would say the failures of the global governance architecture. So, for example, what I mean to say is that the United Nations framework, today celebrating its 75th anniversary, is actually one of the institutions that we would expect to be taking the lead in distributing a scarce resource around the world. But because of rising nationalism, the human society is being organized along nation states as opposed to having a world government. We're then humanity is investing a lot of attention, scrutiny and hopes into COVAX, thinking that it will be the be-all and end-all solution for the distribution of a scarce resource, in this case a COVID vaccine. So I'll be the first to say that it's the least imperfect vehicle. There are many limitations and I think we can talk about that. But on balance, the trade-offs are that this is probably the best bet that humanity has in ensuring fair, equal and speedy access to a COVID-19 vaccine.
Right. I do want to say that, we'll have to get into the details of this system because it does have two tiers. It only promises 20% of the population of any participating country access to vaccine and so on and so forth. So before we get into that, the question that arises, I guess, in my mind about this is whether we poo-pah, vaccine nationalism as being, or poo-poo rather, vaccine nationalism as being bad. But, when we look to our leaders, we want them to do the best they can for Malaysia. So in some sense, we are also nationalists. Multilateralism is great, but not at the expense of national interests. Do you think by joining the system, we have the national interests at heart?
I do, Sharaad. I agree with you very much so that even Malaysia would be having some sort of vaccine nationalism on our own. For example, on the heels of the announcement that we're joining COVAX, the Minister for Science, Technology and Innovation also announced that Malaysia is in discussions with some Chinese vaccine producers. And we are also pursuing some bilateral and, separate agreements outside of COVAX as well. Vaccine nationalism is a term that's often bandied around. I think we should be realistic about it because voters, taxpayers and citizens belong to nation states, and although this is a species-wide problem and we really should have a species-wide solution, COVAX is our best attempt at the species-wide solution, granting the realistic problems, shall we say, of the responsibility of sovereign governments to their voters and to the taxpayers.
All right, well, I want to talk a little bit about the structure of COVAX, about the fact that it's kind of separated into the wealthy countries and the low and middle income countries. About 80 high income countries will finance the COVID-19 vaccines from their own budgets, and 92 or so low and middle income countries will receive financial support. Malaysia has been classified by the WHO as a upper middle income economy. That means we will be self-financing. So what are the trade-offs in that? Because that is a huge cost commitment for the national budget.
First, let's talk about the cost itself. Imagine you're booking a hotel room. So you pay a little less if you committed to the hotel room, and you pay a little more if you want the option to cancel. So Malaysia has the option of paying a little less. For example, it's only $1. It's not only, it's $1 for 1 dose of vaccine in the committed path, and in the, shall we say, non-committed path or optional purchase agreement, that's the path, the name of the path, you'll be paying $3.20. So Malaysia has that option, but we do have to fork out the money in the first, in the beginning as a form of because we're self-financed. Melissa, to elaborate a little bit on Malaysia's status, I would say that Malaysia is in a bit of a reverse Goldilocks scenario. Reverse Goldilocks in the sense that we're not rich enough for us to be able to self-finance very, very comfortably, but neither are we so poor that we need a foreign assistance. So it's that uncomfortable middle that we find ourselves trapped in, alongside a few other upper middle income countries. We're not Europe or North America, but we're not, shall we say, in Africa or in the developing parts of the world as well. And for that particular group of countries, the COVAX facility is strangely not really supportive, because we've got the self-financing countries when they're very comfortably able to meet their requirements, and the poorer countries will be helped and aided by overseas development assistance. But it's those countries in the middle that will find it difficult, and Malaysia is one of them.
Now, I do want to ask you about the pricing, because it seems that the critics are saying the pricing is not set yet. The number that you mentioned isn't the final price of the drug, is it? It is just the initial commitment to the pool of money that COVAX feels it needs in order to engage in this particular arrangement. Could you explain further?
This is very true, Sharaad. Well, there are a few factors, and I'll just give a bit of a laundry list. The first factor is the actual production cost, which nobody can estimate because we don't know the complexity of the vaccine. We also don't know how many doses are required. And it could be the scenario envisaged by COVAX is 2 doses, but we could need 3. Or a booster dose or a 4th dose as well. So these are the complexities around the pricing. And because we don't know yet, we aren't able to really project the price. But most analysts are projecting a price of between $10 to $20 for the entire course of the vaccine. And that appears to be a fairly reasonable number, which could be driven down with economies of scale. And that's what COVAX seeks to do. By providing an advanced market commitment, they're assuring manufacturers that it's okay for you to invest in building more factories. And when you invest in building more factories, you'll be able to drive the unit cost lower, which could see the price coming a little less than $10. But all these things are projections at the moment.
I mean, speaking, you have, on a previous show, kind of explained a little bit about the COVAX facility. You said it's like insurance. You're spreading risk, right? And the way they spread risk is that Malaysia doesn't necessarily have to choose a winner, right? We have a group winner situation. But of the 170 vaccine candidates, COVAX is only committed to, I understand, 18. 9 that are for sure, and then but there's no guarantee that those 18 will be producing the winning horse, is it?
That is true.
So what happens then?
Well, for a start, there are 170 vaccine candidates at the moment in various stages of clinical trials. The COVAX facility has committed to 9 vaccines that it thinks has the highest chance of success. How do they make this determination? Through a list of scientific and technical criteria, judged by experts who are, well, famous and experienced in their field. So that's 9.
But not fallible.
Not fallible. Okay. They're not infallible for sure.
They're infallible.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there will be another 9 candidates, so making a total of 18. Yeah. So the next candidates number 10 to 18 are under consideration. Okay. Your question, Sharaad, is what happens if vaccine candidate number 19 is the winner? And my answer is market forces will probably drive candidate number 19 or company number 19 into the COVAX facility because they want to have the market of 3/4 of the world's population. And that kind of that size of the market will be an important incentive for the company to come in.
Okay, but isn't there a possibility, Swee Kheng, that this COVAX group compact might break up in the event that number 19 is the one that produces that? In fact, they will say, okay, I'm going to do good by my own country and my population and my voter base and leave COVAX. Is that a possibility too?
There's a very real possibility. We can approach this from the field of geopolitics and the analysis of power structures around the world. We can also make the moral case that we need to care for everyone else in the whole world. And finally, there's a public health case that a pandemic somewhere is a pandemic everywhere. And we can make all these cases, but the public health and the economic and the moral case aside, it's really a question of power.
Okay, all right. Swee, we're going to take a quick break, but we'll come back and continue this conversation with you. But first, we will be speaking after this to Sangeeta Sashikant from the Third World Network. That's coming up in just a couple of minutes. Stay tuned to consider this. You're watching Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. With me is Sharaad Kuttan. Now, to continue our discussion about Malaysia's participation in the global COVAX COVID-19 vaccine access plan, we have joining us on the show tonight Sangeeta Sashikant. She's a legal advisor for Third World Network, which looks at issues relating to equity in trade, technology and development. Sangeeta, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us on the show tonight.
Thank you very much.
Taking into consideration the reality of vaccine nationalism and the free market principles by which pharmaceutical companies operate, is this COVAX facility the best deal that Malaysia and countries similar to ours can hope for in terms of access to a potential vaccine?
Thank you very much. Clearly, COVAX is being discussed quite a bit at the international level. I think the challenge we have is there are quite a few uncertainties and a number of questions unanswered around COVAX. And I think these are some of the issues that we need to highlight, even if as Malaysia is participating, for instance, around transparency, its design, accountability, pricing. And then there are real issues around vaccine nationalism. For instance, a lot of countries are entering into bilateral deals, right? So the question is, to what extent companies are able to deliver on their commitments to COVAX? Because a lot of bilateral deals are being signed, and supply is limited. So I think there is a lot of uncertainty around that issue.
Sangeeta, what about the kind of leveraging power that Malaysia has? A small, medium-sized country with a reasonably small population. We do have things like compulsory licensing and legal structures to perhaps play into the question of how do we balance our actual leverage against many other countries and pharmaceutical companies. How would you kind of characterize our strengths?
So, as Malaysia is discussing the terms of the COVAX, I think it can leverage in terms of ensuring, firstly, more transparency. I think one issue that has really raised concern internationally is that the entire design of COVAX, it has not really gone through a proper inclusive discussions at the international level. It's led by Gavi, and it's basically decisions that the Secretariat of Gavi and the Board of Gavi have made. And so there are a lot of issues around transparency. There are a lot of issues around how is COVAX going to handle the bilateral deal. So we can bring more transparency into this. So for instance, as Malaysia is engaging with COVAX, it can demand for more transparency. For example, in terms of what deals are being made, what are the terms of the deals. For instance, COVAX has signed a deal with AstraZeneca, and until today, no one knows the terms of that deal that they have signed. Then there is the issue of pricing. A lot of countries, there is uncertainty, as was mentioned earlier, there's uncertainty as to the pricing of the product. So the question is, what kind of price will be put in place? There is a lot of concern that companies will implement tier pricing. Companies will be allowed to profiteer from a global public health crisis. Right.
So, Sangeeta, if I may interrupt you, I just want to clarify that you mentioned Gavi being the vaccine alliance. And I want to ask you, you brought up transparency and said that Malaysia should negotiate for more transparency. Are there other countries who are also concerned about transparency and putting the issue of transparency on the table in their negotiations?
I hope so. I mean, civil society have definitely raised the issue of transparency, inclusiveness, the whole issue of accountability, governance structure, whether the governance structure is going to be inclusive and representative. Just to come back to the pricing issue, for instance, there is no clarity on what prices will be put in place. So Gavi has said basically they will perhaps opt for, companies may opt for tier pricing, and this may mean that different prices in different countries. But what we know is countries are pushing for a flat price that can be applied across the board. I mean, we are in a totally unprecedented global health crisis. And I think companies should not be profiteering from this crisis.
Sangeeta, I think many of us would agree with you about the question of profiteering. But the issue also, as you say, is unprecedented. We don't know actually whether there'll be a vaccine. This is on the presumption that a vaccine is found and discovered. So are there a lot of unknowables that make it actually difficult to make demands about pricing now on a thing that might not even pan out in the next 12 months? How do you make the, how do you insist on those particulars and transparency in a rather uncertain scenario?
So as different contracts are being signed by companies, I think there has to be certain conditions attached to the contracts that are signed with companies. And COVAX has to make a commitment to transparency. So for instance, how is the price going to be set? What is going to be the production price? Is there going to be transparency in production price? Are the details of how the price is being set going to be revealed? I think these are some of the basic issues that need to be addressed as we move ahead with COVAX.
Sangeeta, let's explore the tiered system. Correct me if I'm wrong, but hasn't the tiered system benefited poorer nations? Isn't that the way? You charge more for high in countries that are more affluent and lower prices? Or is that, if I'm misunderstanding what a flat rate might be?
Yes, sometimes prices are charged at a very, very high price. It does not mean necessarily poorer countries have low prices. We also know a fact that sometimes poorer countries have quite high prices because the companies are only targeting to provide treatment for the elite population in that country. So it's not necessarily the case that poorer countries will have lower prices. I think, but the more important fact is that there should be transparency with respect to how price is going to be set, and in particular, transparency with respect to the production cost in the manufacturing of the vaccine. And very important to note is that, in a lot of the manufacturing happening now, a lot of the R&D that is happening now is heavily funded by taxpayers' money. So I think there is an obligation to transparency and accountability by companies, but also by COVAX.
What about compulsory licensing, Sangeeta? Is that something that Malaysia should hold on to, both for the vaccine and also in terms of therapeutic drugs for the treatment of COVID-19?
So compulsory licensing is a very valid legal tool that Malaysia has under international law. It is there in the patent law. And where it is necessary, Malaysia should be using compulsory license and other flexibilities that are available in its intellectual property laws as well.
Okay, well, Sangeeta, thank you so much for joining us on the show tonight. We really appreciate your time as well as your insights. We're going to take a quick break here on the show, but after this, we'll come back to our studio guest, Dr. Khor, Kheng, and discuss more about Malaysia's participation in COVAX. Stay tuned. Thank you so much for staying with Sharaad and I on Consider This. Let's continue our conversation with Dr. Khor, Kheng. He's one of the founders of the advocacy group Malaysian Health Coalition. So we're discussing Malaysia's announcement that it will be joining 172 countries to participate in COVAX. Kheng, the non-participation of the US and China, could you see that as being detrimental to the success of COVAX and its goal of equitable access?
Yes, it could be detrimental to the goals of achieving equitable access, but just because the US and China are not in it doesn't mean that the rest of the world shouldn't try to gang up. And I think ganging up is the best way for us to achieve fair and equitable access. There are also understandable reasons why the US and China will probably don't want to be a part of COVAX. Number one, under the presidency of Mr. Trump in America, they're pursuing an increasingly nationalistic tone. And China would think that they can have they have trust in their own science and therefore their own health diplomacy. Maybe these two countries will eventually use their science, their capital, their networks and their expertise and manufacturing capacity to try to extend the domestic and foreign policy objectives as well. But those are conversations for future episodes, perhaps.
Okay, so we have this strength in numbers approach to the question of the vaccine. Have we and should we abandon thinking about ASEAN as a regional grouping? Because I know that there are also these structures that are available regionally. Is that something that's completely now abandoned? Do we need to go with the world, as it were?
For the purposes of the COVID vaccine, a global public good, my bet would be to go to the COVAX facility because it's truly global. ASEAN, if we focus on ASEAN, the infrastructure surrounding ASEAN is heavy on rhetoric, and in the health space is very heavy on trade-related aspects of health. For example, health tourism, medical tourism, the mutual recognition of health professionals. There are very few infrastructure or institutions within ASEAN that is capable of coping with the needs for a regional vaccine. About the only regional entity that can have their own vaccine will be Europe. The African region, Eastern Mediterranean region, or Pan America Health Organization will probably be unlikely to be able to come with their own vaccines, which is why I think Malaysia's best bet and Southeast Asia's best bet is to go into COVAX. Side note, all 10 Southeast Asian nations are in COVAX.
Okay, I want to come back to the question of compulsory licensing we brought up with Sangeeta, which will allow us to, to buy generic products, so bypassing the pharmaceuticals, maybe bypassing the intellectual property rights and so on and so forth. Is that something, and I believe the MP of Klang, Charles Santiago, brought this up, asked a question to the health minister about this. Is there a downside to us either respecting intellectual property rights when it comes to something as important as the vaccine for COVID, or ignoring intellectual property rights and disregarding it?
Well, we'll begin in 2001 when the Doha round of the World Trade Organization allowed compulsory licensing in the course or in the matters of national health or public health emergencies. So we do have the ability to pull the trigger. And Malaysia has indeed pulled the trigger on compulsory licensing in our hepatitis C medicine with a company in America called Gilead. So we have done this before. Other countries that have done it is India and South Africa as it relates to the HIV epidemic happening in these two countries. So Malaysia does have the ability to do so. Can we do it? Yes, we can. Should we do it is a more difficult question. And there are pros and cons. I err slightly on the side, 51-49, Sharaad, these are very difficult decisions. I err slightly on the side of not pulling the compulsory licensing trigger until we have more information, specifically information about the pricing, the manufacturing capacity, and also the access. Because pulling the compulsory licensing trigger requires us to go to World Trade Organization. There will be backlash from the larger countries in the world, like America, that's weaponizing their foreign trade and their trade policies as well. And frankly, as a medium power, we don't want to be on the wrong side of the intellectual property wars as well.
Okay, so now that we have, the deadline has passed, Malaysia said that we're joining COVAX. What's next? I mean, do we sit back and wait for a vaccine to be discovered? What is the next step?
A lot of the steps that Malaysia needs to take would lie outside the national borders. But let me talk a little bit about what Malaysia can do within our borders and then talk about what lies outside our borders. Within our borders will be two things. One, transparency. So I love what Sangeeta has said. The transparency should also come from the government of Malaysia to the people of Malaysia. For example, 20% of the population will receive the first doses. Who will be deciding who are these 20%? Which categories will be decided, and so on? So it's the
government, the local governments that will decide who the 20% are, right? Okay.
And it's not written into the COVAX deal that the most vulnerable, that frontliners
high risk,
should be the ones getting this, get the first dibs on vaccine?
No. So COVAX is, a lot of people are investing a lot of hope into COVAX, but it's not the be-all end-all magic solution. What COVAX is doing is relying on something called the SAGE, or the Strategic Advisory Group of Experts in the World Health Organization, that's come out with this beautiful 17-page document. I've read it, so you don't have to. And it says WHO recommends for the consideration of nation states 3 categories. First one is essential workers in the healthcare and social care sectors. Number 2, adults more than 65 years old. And number 3, adults with comorbidities, so high-risk adults. But nation states are not obliged to follow the recommendations of the World Health Organization.
And should they be? So these are guidelines. You said, should we be, or even, and Sangeeta mentioned civil society, insisting that, at least on a domestic level, that these commitments be put in or written down so that we can hold any government to account for how they use the dosage if they come?
Absolutely. Before COVID, we already have so much inequality in society. COVID is accelerating that inequality. If the rich, the powerful, the well-off, the healthy, the young, for example, get access to the vaccine before the poor, the powerless, the weak, the vulnerable, and on and on, then we can see inequality accelerating within our society. So it's crucial for us to have transparency. That's only one thing that we need to do within our national borders. Secondly, is to prepare the vaccine infrastructure. When we vaccinate for polio and BCG for tuberculosis, for example, we're vaccinating small groups of the population. For example, everybody in standard 6 in Malaysia at any given year. But a mass population vaccination carries massive logistics. We have to figure out crime, for example, fraud, tampering, theft, black market profiteering. We have to consider the logistics and the supply chain and the cold chain, because we have to keep it between 2 to 4 degrees Celsius, for example. Then we have to figure out identity management, for example, to make sure that everybody's dosed once, nobody's dosed twice, and none of these leaks out to different countries. That's just within our national borders. And if you go outside our national borders, what Sangeeta said is very true. Malaysia needs a stronger seat at the global decision-making table. Without emerging country representatives and representatives on Southeast Asia or Malaysia being there, then decisions will usually be made, most often be made in this proverbial smoke-filled rooms. And I don't like this smoke-filled rooms, because we, as in the marginalized, traditionally underrepresented populations around the world, deserve to be at the global decision-making table.
Right. Okay, well, there's still quite a lot to be done, to be sorted out before...
And quite a lot to talk about, clearly. We're going to have you back, and others who are interested in this issue. Yeah.
Thank you so much for being on the show tonight. We really appreciate your time. That's all the time we have on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
Thank you so much for watching, folks. Good night.